We're discussing the situation at the front with our guest. Yevhen Diki, former platoon commander of the Adar Battalion, is joining us live. Yevhen, good afternoon. Thank you for taking the time to join us. Glory to Ukraine.
Glory to the heroes. Good afternoon.
So, which directions are currently the hottest? What's happening there? And what would you like to draw attention to?
Well, to begin with, there still aren't any cold sectors on our front, just as there never were. In fact, this division into hot and cold directions is very arbitrary. When you're sitting on a couch in Kyiv, or even if, for example, you're working somewhere at headquarters with the Delta system, then for you, there is a difference in how many attacks are happening on which sector of the front. That's it. So when you're sitting on the couch, it seems to you that you understand this difference. When you're actually working with Delta, for you, it's a matter of resources and things like that. But when you're really there on the line, believe me, for the soldier who is now holding the defense there and making this broadcast possible for us, for him, there is absolutely no difference whether there are more attacks in the Huliaipol direction or, for example, in his sector in the Sumy region. Because for him personally, for that one soldier, every moment is a single attack, a single risk, a direct threat to his life. That's it. And in this regard, it's not easy for our defenders anywhere. In other words, the front is basically hot everywhere. The difference is really just in numbers, but even this numerical difference, it doesn't fall on one person, because where the orcs have fewer forces, well, we also allow ourselves to keep fewer of our defenders there, since they need to be redeployed to where the orcs have more troops. Overall, for each soldier, the level of tension is about the same across the entire front. I'd like to get this idea across because we often, especially in the rear, start, excuse my bluntness, acting smart and begin to think about the war in terms of maps, directions, and arrows. Let's leave that to the generals, and let's just remember what a truly difficult ordeal each of our defenders is going through. Right now, at any given moment, whenever we talk about this. But as for the perspective, let's say the perspective through the map and the Delta system, I would say that in terms of defense, things are hardest right now in the Pokrovsk direction. There's nothing new about that. It's simply the direction that the orcs, let's say, have pinned the most hopes on for the past year. And the fact that over the past year, these hopes have not materialized is, for some reason, still not an argument for them. So they keep trying to break through in this very direction. Why? It's clear. Because if they succeed, it will pose a huge threat to the entire part of Donbass that remains under Ukrainian control. That's why they've been fighting in Pokrovsk for over a year now. That's it. But for now, they're just fighting there. They remain stuck in it. How did that saying go? You see London and die. For many Russians, their entire military career basically comes down to see Pokrovsk and die. The number of Russians who actually make it to Pokrovsk is significantly smaller than those who, on the contrary, end up leaving Pokrovsk. But I would like to draw attention to some other directions. In those areas, taking advantage, among other things, of the fact that the Russians have become so focused on Pokrovsk, we managed to seize the initiative. So at first, this was in the Zaporizhzhia direction. There, we managed, let's say, to seize the initiative quite well and significantly improve our positions. After that, the Russians had to pull some of their forces out of Donbass. And still, they have now stabilized the situation there. That is, we're no longer advancing there, right? But due to the fact that, as I said, we initially made good progress there, significantly improved our positions, and then forced them to transfer a considerable part of their reserves there, meaning they had to ease the pressure on Pokrovsk itself. And their stabilization has occurred. The situation is, well, more or less balanced now. We're more or less, let's say, fighting them with equal forces there, right? But meanwhile, we moved further ahead. For some reason, it went almost unnoticed, but now there are actually no Russians left at all in the territory of the Dnipropetrovsk region. That is, in Dnipro, well, there weren't that many of them there to begin with. They only managed to take a small piece of the Dnipropetrovsk region, but now, even in that small area, we've seized the initiative, and they've already been, they've basically been driven out from almost everywhere. So right now, what are we actually doing? The current position of our command is as follows: not to remain in a purely defensive posture, but to launch tactical counteroffensive actions wherever any opportunity arises. We shouldn't fool ourselves into thinking this is some kind of major counteroffensive. That's not even being discussed. At the moment, we simply don't have enough reserves for that. Greetings to our rear, which is diligently sabotaging the mobilization. But within the limits of, let's say, the people we currently have at the front, a decision has been made that even tactical counteroffensives are still more advantageous for us right now than just sitting in a purely defensive position and waiting for the orcs to attack in waves. This is an interesting feature of the current stage of this war. It's very different from what it was even just, say, a year or a year and a half ago. The thing is, well, previously the classic rule we were all taught applied, that those who are on the defensive always suffer fewer losses than those who are attacking. That still holds true, in a way, right? But not always. The thing is, there's now such a concept as the infiltration zone. In the press, it's more often called the kill zone. But that's more of a movie term, whereas infiltration zone is actually much more accurate in this context. It's the area that's neither ours nor the orcs. But this isn't the gray zone, where neither we nor the enemy are present. On the contrary, it's the area where both we and the enemy are actively present at the same time. And most importantly, it's the zone that's completely controlled by drones, both ours and, unfortunately, the enemy's as well. In other words, this is essentially a zone of joint control by both sides, where they are closely intertwined, constantly engaging in direct, literally firefight contact, and most importantly, both sides control the entire area with drones. Currently, the width of this infiltration zone is up to 50 kilometers, and it has, in fact, replaced the old classic front line. And it turned out that during battles in the infiltration zone, during fighting in the kill zone, when we move to counteroffensive actions, we inflict greater losses on the enemy. But war is actually not about kilometers on a map. War is about how many people each side kills. Sorry for being so blunt, but that's the essence of war. It's about who destroys more of the other side. So it turns out that even during tactical counteroffensives, our loss ratio improves dramatically. If in defense, it's about 1 to 3. By the way, just as the textbooks say, wherever we seize the initiative, the loss ratio is 1 to 5, 1 to 6 in our favor. That's why, right now, wherever we can, we seize the initiative for as long as possible until the enemy brings in significant reserves. Then we switch to another sector. That's roughly how things look right now.
Oh, Evgeny, that's a very comprehensive answer. That was some excellent analysis. I have a few clarifications, yes, about what influences the situation at the front. Recently, there have been a lot of long-range Ukrainian strikes, particularly on oil refining facilities. Reuters analysts are already saying that 40% have been knocked out. Long-range strikes have also targeted, for example, the Flamingo. Ukrainians attacked a Russian explosives plant. Yes, let's not discuss it from an economic perspective. It's more interesting from a military one. How do these strikes,
Not discussing the economy.
right? How does it specifically impact the situation at the front, right? What do we actually see happening?
Well, yes, we're setting the economy aside, although in reality it can't really be ignored. The entire Russian war effort is sustained by their valuable money. You see, they've long since run out of volunteers, about 3.5 years ago, and they've been out of mobilized soldiers for about 3 years now, and they're still afraid to announce a new large-scale mobilization. They're relying on mercenaries paid with money. That's why the question of how much money they have directly affects the situation at the front. And the last time we talked on air about a similar topic, we were proud that we had taken down 25% of Russian oil refining capacity. But a couple of months have passed since then, and now the figure is 40%. And what's more, that's not our number, not a Ukrainian figure, it's a number from external analysts. So this tactic, let's say, of bleeding this monster dry, and oil is the lifeblood of Russia. The whole empire relies on oil and gas. So the tactic of bleeding the monster dry is really effective economically. And now it's especially important since Trump lifted the sanctions. Yes, the Russians are almost dancing with joy. Oil prices soared because of Trump's adventure in Iran, and the sanctions were lifted from them. It would seem that now money will just start pouring into the treasury, but it won't if it's physically impossible to sell that oil. The money won't flow if the infrastructure is on fire. The money won't flow if the Russian terminal is completely destroyed. So this is very much about the war. This isn't just about the economy. But if we talk about direct impact on the front lines, here the bigger role is played by the fact that we have now started systematically taking out, with our pink birds, we have started using flamingos to strike their military factories. Let me remind you that the first target was the factory that actually produces missiles for the Iskander systems. So the first strike on this factory was carried out by Flamingo. And there, it's unclear what exactly is inside that workshop, but there's just a hole in the workshop roof with a diameter of 24 meters. I think at this point, there's no need to even look at what's inside that workshop anymore. That's it. And now we've struck the largest explosives factory in Russia. So Russia has a powerful old defense industrial complex inherited from the Soviet Union. But the peculiarity of this complex is that it relies specifically on large monopoly enterprises, which cannot be replaced by other factories. For example, if there are only 2 factories in all of Russia that produce explosives, one larger, one smaller, well, the larger one is the one we've already hit. That is, and let me also remind you about the Kremny L plant, which specifically produces control boards for Russian missiles. This plant is the only one of its kind. It isn't duplicated by any other enterprise, and we've already hit it. So you just shouldn't expect this to have an effect within a week or a month. The thing is, there are already some stockpiles that have been produced and stored in warehouses, but these stockpiles need to be replenished regularly when you're fighting a war of such intensity. And now the question of replenishment arises when it's precisely the monopoly plants, which are the critical link in this supply chain, that are being taken out.
Evgeny, we literally have just half a minute left. I was really intrigued by the statistics. The drone forces published that in a month, yes, they destroyed 30 Russian air defense systems, including Buk and Tor radars. I just have a question. As a military man, can you explain, does the Ukrainian army have to be at such a high level to strike what is supposed to protect against attacks? Am I understanding this correctly? We literally have 30 seconds.
It's not about it being accidental. It's not by chance. There is a deliberate hunt for Russian air defense systems. For this hunt, our drone forces have developed an entirely separate tactic. Well, generally speaking, we can talk about it in broad terms because in general, the Russians understand this. We won't disclose the details. But in general terms, the essence is that it's like fishing with live bait. That is, when our drones head towards some distant target deep inside Russia, we now have the technical capability, not going into details, to track when one of them gets shot down. And so when one of them is shot down, we quickly determine where it was hit from, and the rest of the drone swarm, instead of heading to their original target, is redirected there to hunt down that air defense system. In other words, we've turned our long-range drones from simply a means to hit a fixed target into, you could say, free hunters. Do you remember, perhaps, that ancient film, The Matrix? There were these flying robots, actual hunters that would select their own targets. Well, in reality, our long-range drones are now behaving in much the same way when it comes to air defense systems. That is, we allow 1 or 2 of the leading drones to be shot down, and then we determine where they were shot down from. And as this statistic shows, usually the Russian air defense doesn't have time to leave that spot or relocate because our drones fly a bit faster than they can drive away.
Thank you very much, Evgeny. This was a very positive conversation, so much good information. Thank you, you're always welcome on Freedom's broadcast.